Now we can officially start because it's now being recorded. Thank you for that fine introduction, Antonia. I'll be honest, I didn't remember that I wrote that back then, although I continue to evolve my thinking on the subject. I also want to thank Professor Tamer for the invitation. It got me back into a field that I was really immersed in when I first came to Emory 27 years ago. And to give it some fresh thought in light of my more recent research and writing is always a good thing for a scholar to do. I also perhaps misunderstood the instructions, and I tried to get the full paper done, a draft of it in advance. Yesterday we had fine presentations that had either sent much briefer material for us to read in advance or just outline form, which in some senses allows the conversation to be more free roaming. I don't want my writing to be seen as the final version of my thinking. I really am excited about these workshopping kind of conferences, which I participated in several times at Oxford in order to put your ideas out there and get the feedback to produce a better result. I do not know, nor do I want to presume that people in advance of the conference read the 34 pages that I sent ahead. So what I'd like to do is to use my time briefly to summarize, to share some thoughts that I didn't put in the paper. So I made a brief PowerPoint. It's not that good because I'm not that good at PowerPoint, and I only had a very short time since I had a busy day yesterday after our conference. So I think I was made co-host or something like that. That comes across, right? Okay. So I'll be using just a few slides, but most of it is in the paper. And I look forward very much to your questions and to your thoughtful reactions about the directions where it can go, especially the last section, which are about interactions with the other faith traditions, as well as practical applications for today, which is, for nowadays, which I would really like to come out in the discussion. All right, so I started my paper by two anecdotes that I think really sum up a lot of where my thinking came from. That's a picture of Reuven Rivlin, who was the outgoing president of the state of Israel, who in late June came to New York City in the United States to kind of say goodbye to the Jewish leaders, the local American Jewish leaders that he worked with the previous 5 years. And his line, which I quote in my paper, which is summed up in the title of the article, "We are simply mishpuche." I don't know if anybody has the Yiddishized pronunciation that they're familiar with, but mishpuche is a Yiddishized version of the Hebrew word mishpacha, which means family. And he says it matter-of-factly, like we are simply, it's incontrovertible. Everybody accepts this idea. And I even asked several Yiddish scholars, all of whom could not remember a time that the concept of mishpuche as a family referring to the Jewish people was not part of Yiddish culture. I called up or emailed several historians of Yiddish, and they said they don't remember a time when you could see this as first emerging. It was always in, as they said, at the DNA of Yiddish. And Yiddish does go back to the High Middle Ages. So that's a very, very long time. But it seemed to me that, and this happened a month after the latest Israel-Gaza conflict, where there was a lot of criticism among American Jews of Israeli policy or behavior. Nevertheless, he wanted to say, look, yeah, we have our differences and we have different locations. It's okay because we're family. And families can have disagreements even though the bonds are still quite intact. And the second story, which happened in Surfside, I'm sure many of you heard about it, the collapse of a multi-story condominium, which left several hundred people dead or missing. And the Israeli army sent in a group of soldiers and commanders who know how to deal with these kinds of emergencies. But the article, the journalist who prepared the article said the byline, or the subheading was, Israeli rescuers are helping alleviate the suffering of Miami, showing that Jews can still resemble a family. And it struck me that as I was sitting down in earnest to pull my thoughts together, having done a lot of reading over the course of last year in preparation for this conference, I said, look, family is the way that this politician and this journalist are thinking about Jews around the world working together. And that crystallized for me the elements of my main thesis. The first is that the concept of family in Judaism is deeply intertwined with the concept of nation, and I'll explain that in a few moments. The second, from which that first one derives, in essence, is, well, if the concept of nation has two poles, and Antonia, I was really interested if what I said a while ago was actually going to repeat this idea. But there's sort of a natural, like every nation perpetuates itself, continues generation after generation, and has a common history, has a common language, has a common culture, often has a common territory. That's one concept of the nation, one pole of the concept of the nation. And the second is the covenantal. That in the case of Judaism, the nation is deeply identified with bearing the mission as portrayed in the Bible of what we would call today the religion of Judaism. And therefore, so going back to the first point of the thesis, if the family is deeply intertwined with the concept of nation, and I'll elaborate on that in a moment, then we should see in the family, in the concept of the family, a similar oscillation and sometimes even tension between the two poles of the natural and the covenantal. And when I say natural, it just means a family will naturally perpetuate itself, has its own stories, etc. Whereas covenantal is deeply connected to the religious identity and function of the family. And then the last part, which is the main body of the article that I prepared for your thinking and critique, is that the conditions of Jewish life throughout the last 2,500 years and earlier, 3,000 years, affect how the concept of nation and therefore family are understood and the prominence of each pole. So there will be times and conditions, even simultaneously, where there may be parts of the Jewish community that are emphasizing the covenantal and hence the family in that vein. And there will be times where the natural notion of the nation, and again, just the natural organic family, what we might call a clan, is emphasized. So that's what I tried to do over the course of the many pages that I hope you had a chance to at least skim. And what I'd like to do for the benefit of our conversation is go over them relatively quickly so that we'll have something to share in the conversation. But the full detail and a lot of the citations can be found in the paper itself. I divide, so going back to the concept of family as nation and nation as family, I really start with the Bible, which conceives primarily in Genesis chapter 10, the post-Diluvian life after Noah and his sons and their spouses come out of the ark, the idea that each family will go off into a territory, settle the land, and essentially grow naturally and organically into a nation. And therefore, when Abraham is called, and then there's Isaac and Jacob chosen, and then Jacob's 12 children, the sense that they will grow into a nation is just deemed the normal way that the Bible sees nations emerging. I'm not getting into the historical of the conquest or settlement theory, but at least the way the Bible portrays it, and that's the way the later Jewish tradition, starting in the Second Temple period, understand it, the Jewish nation is a very large family. At the same time, that connection means that the family is a nation in microcosm. So just like the nation as the enlarged family means that there is the mutual responsibility and shared fate and concern that a family would have, the family takes on what I call the two poles of national perpetuation. One in terms of, let's say, having children and raising them within the national identity, but also the covenantal, that a family is supposed to pass along the tradition. So it's not like one thinks of Christendom, but Jews as the nation charged originally by Abraham and then at the covenant at Sinai to follow the covenant, so too the family is charged, parent to children, to induct the children into a way, to launch them into a life of continuing the covenantal charge or mission. And what I try to do is to track that over the course of Jewish history. And for that, I divide the 3,000 years of Judaism into a First Temple period, a Second Temple period under Persian, Greek, and then Roman rule, with 100 years there in the middle, or near the end of Hasmonean independent state. So Jews had their own country and statehood, a political entity. A rabbinic period in late antiquity, so roughly from around the time of shortly after Jesus, the destruction of the temple in 70, all the way till the Islamic late antiquity in terms of 6th, 7th centuries. And then a 1,000-year period under Crescent and Cross, which is North Africa, Near East under Crescent, and Europe under Cross. And then a modern period, which was really launched only in the last 190 years, 200 years, where Jews are accepted or not accepted into the state as citizens. And I think that that has a profound effect on the concept of family, with its two poles of national identity as well as covenantal. So I'm going to just touch on these briefly because I want to hear your comments and questions. I take the First Temple period, as many scholars point out, to be deeply connected with the senses of tribe, a tribe as an enlarged family, There was a tribal confederation, the monarchy, and the tribes are subdivided into clans, which is really a tighter notion of an extended family. But with the rise of the united monarchy and then the split monarchy, the king and the administrative state, in essence, become like the father and the family. So you see the family is an extension of the nation or a microcosm of the nation, and you don't hear a lot about the covenantal role. It's in the Second Temple period, initially under Persian rule, where some level of autonomy comes in. There was a province called Yehud, and the Jews were Yehudim, and they were given a temple that was paid for by the emperor, but there was no king. So while they did have a province, and therefore they had territoriality, they seem to have brought with them that strong sense of clans that were preserved during the Babylonian exile. And we see that very profoundly, but at the same time, Ezra and Nehemiah, according to the biblical accounts, are really trying to impress the importance of covenant. And so, for instance, when at the end of Ezra and as well in Nehemiah, the foreign women and families are expelled, there's a sense that the family has to assume the identity, not just of a nation continuing with whoever marries and has children, but the covenantal role, which is to preserve the rules of the Torah, which is the covenantal ceremony in Ezra chapter 8. So I think it's significant that we begin to see these two poles that I've identified in the Second Temple period, but we see it most, I think, in a phenomenon that I develop in the paper in the late Second Temple period called two types of Judaic communities. The natural, which is based on ethnic bonds, and intentional, which one might call, in my parlance, a greater focus on the covenantal. Intentional communities like Sadducees, like Pharisees, like Essenes, or the Qumran community, the Therapeutae in Egypt, where an ideal vision of Jewish life, where what does it mean to be Jewish? It's the covenant. And so passing that on to the next generation is critical. Strict discipline, tighter boundaries instead of the porous boundaries of the natural community. And to me, the fact that there are these two types of communities highlights or underscores the two poles that I've been trying to develop. And we see the families adopting this. In other words, we still see the clans in Josephus, that idea of families are very important, but there's also a sense of purity, a Pharisaic family, a Sadducee family. It's not just a Jewish family. It's a sense of our community has to pass this on. And in some respects, such as in some of the groups in the Judean hills who were ascetic, who didn't have physical families, they saw their commune as a kind of family, and we'll see that resurfacing in the next period. The natural community has ethnic bonds, and they share a symbolic vocabulary, but the boundaries are porous. And I think this is going to be something that carries along Jewish history till today. Whereas intentional, there's a belief in a superior Judaic way of living with strict rules and discipline and a deliberate, intentional way of living Jewishly. These are the communities, by the way, where we see processes of conversion. And as I mentioned in the paper, I would view the early Christian community, the early Jesus movement, as a subset of this intentional Judaic community that saw its way of living the covenant as ideal and needed to be transmitted. But now there's that tightness of a family within that commune. The rabbinic period sees an emphasis on family because of the loss of temple, the loss of statehood, the loss of any kind of political formation. the rabbis, to me, extend the Pharisaic notion and embrace the idea of covenantal dimension as essential to family. When a man and a woman marry, it's not just a natural event as in the rest of humanity, uniting and bearing children. It must include the Shekhinah. And I quote something from Genesis Rabbah, a midrash of the 3rd century, a Babylonian Talmud from the 6th century. There are 3 partners in a human's creation: the Holy One, the Father, and the Mother. So you can see here that the covenantal role is indeed being emphasized. But at this and here we see the family is meant to be a carrier, a bearer of that covenantal role. This is a Mishnah or a Tannaitic source in Babylonian Talmud Ta'anit. I quoted in the paper. You could see near the end when they would pair off a kind of dating scene. Near the last 6 lines: young man, please lift up your eyes and see what you choose for yourself for a wife. Do not set your eyes toward beauty, but set your eyes toward a good family. As the verse states, grace is deceitful and beauty is vain, but a woman who fears the Lord, she shall be praised. In other words, if you want to find a woman who's fearful of the Lord, look at the family. It's not just a high-class family. It's a family will tell you what kind of children she's going to raise. And that's an emphasis to me on the covenantal role of the family. At the same time, again, I just have these quotes up, the importance of marriage and family as a way of perpetuating. There's no state, there's no political entity. Jews are scattered, they're in small communities. There's the imperative to marry and have children, as these sources are cited from B.T. Yevamot. But at the same time, there's small rabbinic communities that constitute their own kind of family. And here we have a statement from Babylonian Talmud Sanhedrin: anyone who teaches another person's son Torah, the verse ascribes him credit as if he sired him, and he's the father. And even to the point that your teacher, your master, if you're a disciple and you're in a rabbinic group, your master actually takes precedence over your physical father. So the idea of family is being transmuted into the covenantal space, almost lock, stock, and barrel. A father-child, sense of mutual responsibility, perpetuation, future generations, etc. Again, I'm looking at the time and I want to make sure we have time for discussion. The medieval period, which is under crescent and cross, there I want to highlight that the Jewish community in a larger sea, S-E-A, of antagonistic hosts who are interested in converting this group, who do not accept them as equals, who suppress them, either Augustine's doctrine of the witness under Christendom or under the crescent, dhimmi status, protected minorities. That sense of otherness, to me, accentuates the sense of the Jewish community as family. And the statement of Maimonides is really powerful. In the laws of gifts to the poor, all Israel and all who are associated with them are like brothers. Notice that it's associated with them. As it is said, you are children of the Lord your God. And if a brother does not show compassion for another brother, then who will have compassion for him? And to whom can the poor of Israel look? To the idolatrous nations that hate them and pursue them? They can only look to rely upon their brothers. The familial metaphors are really powerful. And the necessarily tight-knit small Jewish communities scattered among Muslims and Christians for about 1,000 years highlight the sense of family. At the same time, there is a strong sense that the rabbinic conception of following the covenant and that Jewish identity. I quoted Saadia Gaon in the paper that Jews are a people only by virtue of the Torah. So observance, the family is expected to follow the Torah, to bring the children up to be good and loyal continuers of the covenantal tradition. That is also part of the medieval conception. And I go into in the paper that there are other offshoots, for instance, Kabbalistic offshoots, that there might be a tighter family joined in mystical kind of communion with again, a kind of guru or mentor. That's true both in Islamic countries as well as Christian countries. But the sense of family as the miniature nation, the kehillah, the Jewish community, is the nation, and the family within it, which was often real family because they were controlled as to who could live where and who, what kind of businesses you could go into by the outside authorities. So they were very often related to one another, but they had a keen sense that the family and the nation were tied together, even though there was no real place to point to that that's the nation. The nation was scattered. Now, the modern period, as I described in the paper, subverts that whole idea of Jewish nationhood because it offers emancipation to the Jews by saying, are you German? Are you French? You can observe Judaism, of course, just like there are Catholics and Protestants, but your national identity must be French or German or British. Notice that I'm mentioning Central and Western European countries. Very strong sense that Judaism is merely a religion or primarily a religion. And so the family is seen as Manfred shared with us yesterday, the idea of the state. It carries on the civic under Luther. So in the same sense, Reformed Jews, for instance, accept this challenge of emancipation, and they expect the family to carry on the sense of Germanness, but also the Mosaic persuasion, the loyalty to the Jewish tradition. So to me, that's an emphasis on covenant. In Eastern Europe, however, there is greater ethnicity. There is failed integration into the state. Jews are oppressed and persecuted, even violently attacked in pogroms. So they develop a stronger sense of Jewish otherness and hence Jewish nationhood, regardless of religious affiliation and observance. So you have ultra-Orthodox saying to the Reform, you're our brothers, you may be errant, you may be deviant, but you're still our family. At the same time, Zionism is emerging as a stronger sense of nation and the family in service of the nation. The kibbutz becomes a family in its socialist iteration. And Israelis today, especially because of the political and security situation, as well as the tight quarters living near, so in a small area, increases the sense of common family. So that to me is an extension of that Eastern European mishpuche that President Rivlin spoke about, as well as the Jews in Surfside, given the fact that by the 1920s, fully 90% of American Jews derived from Eastern European Ashkenazi sources. So to me, that's what highlights the pole, if you will, of national perpetuation. At the same time, you have today other groups trying to push, like the ultra-Orthodox, that it's the covenantal side that is more pronounced through your attachment to a Rebbe, let's say, among the Hasidim, or tighter knit communities in the yeshiva, which is the Institute of Higher Intensive Jewish Learning, that's the nation. And so you really have fragmentation going on in the modern period among different visions, which I argue at the end of the paper might actually be propelling the embrace of the notion of family as the Jewish nation as family, to paper over the differences, to allow people to avert their gaze from the deeper political, religious, and other kinds of differences, in order to say, I accept you as my brother regardless of what you believe and how you behave. What I'm really interested to discuss in the coming hour is the other things about practical application, and especially in terms of the interactions with Christians and Muslims, to see where there might be commonality. I did touch on some of that mostly in the footnotes, but I hope you saw that my orientation was conceptual with, Antonia, that sense of historical influence over the different iterations of Jewish life over the last 2,500 years, influencing the prominence, the salience, the centrality of one or the other pole, or even the creation of new ideas along the way. So it's 8:36. I think I filled my 30 minutes. I hope you got a sense. In rereading the paper in preparation for today, I said, wow, I really tried to pack in a lot in there. So, so I didn't give it justice today, this morning or this afternoon, but I hope in the conversation we'll be able to take advantage of those alleyways that we didn't get to talk about in the half hour. Thank you very much.
Thank you for this enlightening lecture speech.